Way back in the early 2000s, I was living what I thought was a stable, if not entirely exciting, family life. My wife and I had been married for several years, and we had 2 young children together. Our daughter was 6 and our son was 4. They were at that age where everything was still innocent, still filled with questions and small discoveries. I used to come home from work and find them waiting by the door, eager to tell me about the new thing they had seen or the silly little song they learned that day. In those moments, I believed we were building something real, something that would last. Marriage was supposed to be about teamwork, compromise, and shared responsibility. At least that's what I told myself when the days grew harder. When the distance between my wife and me stretched like an invisible cord, neither of us seemed willing to pull taut again. But even during those years, there were small things, subtle signs I ignored because I didn't want to see them clearly. People always say hindsight makes everything obvious, and they're right. Looking back, I can trace every single clue like breadcrumbs, leading me straight to the truth I was too afraid to admit. It began with my kids talking about spending time with their grandparents, my wife's parents. At first, it sounded innocent enough. Her parents lived about 90 minutes away, not exactly a quick trip, but close enough for occasional visits. The kids would come home with stories of grandma's cookies or how grandpa let them play with tools in the garage. Harmless, right? Except it started happening 2, sometimes 3 times a week. That was nearly every day my wife was at her part-time job. I found it strange but didn't want to seem paranoid. I asked her casually why she was going there so often, and she brushed it off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She said the kids needed more family time, and her parents loved helping out. Still, something in my gut twisted. I grew up in a family where both of my parents cheated on each other, and the chaos that caused in our household never really left me. I had sworn I would never put my kids through anything like that. So when I noticed her car racking up extra miles, when I did the math and realized she was driving 400 miles more a week than her routine should have required, I knew something was wrong. My wife was never a good liar. When pressed, she stumbled over her words, overcompensated with details, or got defensive in ways that set my teeth on edge. Then came the day that cracked the entire facade. I was at home, sitting down at the computer we shared. This was back in the days when AOL was still a major thing, and people scribbled down their passwords on scraps of paper instead of relying on the cloud. She had left a sticky note with her password sitting right there next to the keyboard. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was the universe giving me permission, but I couldn't resist. My hands shook as I typed it in, heart pounding in my chest as if I were the one doing something wrong. But as soon as her inbox opened, all doubts vanished. There it was in black and white, emails between her and her college best friend, casual exchanges where she bragged about sleeping with one of her old high school boyfriends. She even mocked the guy's wife, making cruel jokes about how she had gained weight after having kids. I remember staring at the screen, bile rising in my throat, every word cutting me deeper. My wife, the mother of my children, the person I trusted to share my life with, was out there humiliating me, turning our marriage into a farce. I printed out those emails and stashed them away, my hands trembling with rage and despair. Proof. I finally had proof. But I wasn't satisfied with just proof. I needed details. I needed to know the scope of her betrayal, to have it documented in a way that couldn't be twisted into some lie later. That's when I reached out to a friend of mine who was a cop. I told him enough to get the point across, and he recommended someone he trusted, a private investigator who had once been on the force but now worked independently. His name was Ron. From the first moment I spoke with him, I knew he was the kind of guy who got things done. No drama, no hesitation, just results. I paid him his retainer and handed over the emails and whatever scraps of information I had about my wife's schedule. It didn't take him long. Ron tracked her movements, noted her patterns, and compiled a report so thorough it made me sick to read. Photos, timestamps, locations, it was all there. She would drop the kids off at her parents' house under the guise of family time, then meet up with her old flame for lunch. From there, they'd head to a seedy motel, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour. They'd spend a few hours together before she picked the kids back up and drove home, as if nothing had happened. The double life she was living was disgusting in its simplicity. Reading Ron's report, I felt something inside me snap. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. I couldn't even look at my marriage the same way. But here's the thing, I wasn't going to blow up like my parents had. I wasn't going to scream, throw things, or let my kids see me fall apart. I wanted control. I wanted to handle this with a precision that would leave no room for her to manipulate the narrative. That's when I called a divorce lawyer. The lawyer was calm, professional, and blunt. He told me that in our state, proof of infidelity wouldn't make much difference in terms of the divorce proceedings, especially since we had kids. But that didn't matter to me. What mattered was protecting my children and making sure they never had to go through the kind of trauma I endured as a child. I told my lawyer I wanted the papers drawn up and ready. Meanwhile, Ron wasn't done. I asked him to dig into the man my wife was cheating with. I wanted to know who he was, what kind of life he had built, and whether he deserved to be shielded from the consequences of his actions. And once again, Ron delivered. The guy's name was Bob. He was married with 3 children of his own. He worked as a vice president of sales for his father-in-law's business. On the outside, he looked like a family man with a respectable job, but beneath the surface, he was just another coward willing to risk everything for a cheap thrill. That's when the pieces of my plan started clicking into place. I wasn't just going to walk away quietly. I wasn't just going to let them destroy my marriage and move on unscathed. No, I was going to make sure both of them felt the weight of their choices. The day my wife was served with divorce papers, she was at work. I arranged it that way deliberately. I wanted her humiliation to be public, undeniable, the kind of thing that spread through the office like wildfire. At the same time, Ron met with Bob's wife. He handed her the full report, photos, dates. Everything she deserved to know. What she did with the information was her choice, but I suspected she wasn't the type to sit quietly and forgive. And I was right. Bob's wife wasted no time. She drained their joint bank account, took the kids, and walked out. Then she went after him legally. The divorce proceedings were brutal, messy, and very public. According to the court documents I later read, she absolutely gutted him. His father-in-law, upon learning about the affair, immediately fired him from the family business. Since the house they lived in was technically owned by her parents, Bob was kicked out of his own home. He lost his job, his marriage, his kids, and his stability all in one sweeping blow. But that wasn't the end of it. Their fight spilled out into the open, leading to police involvement, restraining orders, even criminal charges. At one point, Bob went back to the house to argue with his wife, and things escalated so badly that her brother stepped in and broke Bob's nose. It was chaos, ugly, violent chaos. Bob, the man who thought he could sneak around and live 2 lives without consequence, saw his entire world collapse in on itself. As for me, my divorce went through cleanly. My wife and I agreed to keep things civil for the sake of the kids. We co-parented without bringing our issues into the open. I didn't scream at her, didn't berate her, didn't drag our children through the mud. To them, life carried on with as little disruption as possible. When they were old enough, I told them the truth in a measured, calm way. Not to poison them against their mother, but because I believed they had a right to understand why their parents weren't together anymore. I never reconciled with my ex-wife beyond what was necessary. We only spoke about the kids, and once they grew up and became adults themselves, our contact ended completely. I don't hate her. Hatred would require too much of my energy, and she isn't worth that. She's simply someone I used to know, someone I once loved, but who burned the bridge between us so thoroughly that there's nothing left but ashes. Bob, on the other hand, disappeared. Last I heard, he left the state entirely, probably to start fresh somewhere far away from the wreckage he caused. His ex-wife, on the other hand, did quite well. She went to work at her father's company, eventually taking over after he retired. She raised her children without the toxicity of a cheating husband hanging over her. She survived, and in many ways she thrived. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the chain reaction that unfolded from one sticky note left on a desk. How a single moment of temptation led me to uncover years of betrayal. How my decision to handle things calmly and strategically brought down not just my wife's lies, but also the entire world of the man she chose to risk everything for. There's a strange satisfaction in that. Not the hot, burning satisfaction of revenge as it's often portrayed in movies, but a colder, steadier kind. Justice, in its purest form, isn't about screaming or violence. It's about balance. It's about consequences finally catching up with people who thought they were untouchable. And if I learned anything through it all, it's that revenge doesn't always have to be loud to be satisfying. Sometimes, the quiet, methodical approach is the most devastating of all.